conduct ourselves in our behavior in a different level than the mitod beitin, than the death sentences or the executions that we saw in Sanhedrin, because the lashes are the more minor infractions, and regular people might have been at risk, let's say, of getting lashes in a way that we could hopefully assume that most people would not have been at risk of an execution by beitin, by the court. So I think that that by itself already makes it come alive, even in an era when we don't have lashes. And I think that when we got to the very end, and we'll read it again now, the story of Rabbi Kiva and the other sages walking in the ruins of Jerusalem at a time when that really signified utter desolation, and Rabbi Akiva sees that and sees the positive in it. I think that's also very helpful and inspiring. I think people quote this last daf of Makkot, all over the place for good reason, because this is a time when we see a rebuilding of Jerusalem, but for the past 18, 19 months, we know it's been very, very difficult. So to be able to be that optimist, looking towards the future, I think is a good reminder that we have that in our tradition as well. Leanne, we have her, of course, our guest, Professor Chaim Seiman. We will get to you in a moment. Leanne is our resident poet, and every Masechet, she has written us a poem, which we value tremendously. And without further ado.
Thank you, Anne. I find myself a little bit behind in the daf, a few pages behind in the daf, and it's been busy. So I'm going to do something that I wrote for Parshat Kitetse, but here we go. I published this 4 years ago, and here we are 4 years later in Masechet Makkot, where punishments for various crimes are described, including Shiluach Haken, or sending the mother bird away from her nest. It says, if along the road you chance upon a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with fledglings or eggs, and the mother sitting over the fledglings or on the eggs, do not take the mother together with her young. Let that mother go and take only the young, in order that you may fare well and have a long life. In Makkot 17a, it says, with regard to the one who takes the mother bird with her fledglings, thereby violating the Torah prohibition, you shall not take the mother with her fledglings. You shall send the mother, and the fledglings you may take for yourself. Rabbi Yehuda says he is flogged for taking the mother bird and does not send the mother. And the rabbis say he sends the mother and is not flogged, as this is the principle. With regard to any prohibition that entails a command to arise and perform a mitzvah, he is not liable to receive lashes for its violation. What I've written is not a piece about the flogging or the need for the flogging or the ultimate identity of who the mother bird was, whether she was good for the sacrifice or not. This is a post about the moment before we take an action, a prohibited action or a permitted action. What are we thinking about when we approach the nest? Are temptations stronger than our urge to do right? Maybe one of the meanings of Masechet Makkot is, yes, punishment for acts, but what about those acts that lead us to these actions? So here's one tiny moment separated from the flogging or anything else that happens later. The mother bird, part 1. And the mother bird builds her nest carefully, artfully. Straw speedily swept up. In her beak is a dried leaf, now a bit of mud, feathers added for softness. She is a sculptor, an artist, a builder of homes, offering shelter for her children. She builds not from love, but from intuition, deep and old. She senses that predators exist. She builds to protect her young, hoping, if a mother bird can hope, that one day they will leave the nest and they will fly away. Part 2. A man walks upon a dusty road, hair the color of moonlight, swinging with his stride. It is morning, and the quiet sings a quiet song. The village is yet far, and the sun is hot. The man pauses to drink for a moment under the branches of a tree. He seeks shelter from the sun. And the man hears a call of warning, the piercing call of a bird. Number 3, the man looks up. Through the leaves, he sees the nest. The mother bird looks down on him, scolding him, warning him, and he begins to climb. He is tall, and his long limbs reach steadily upward. He is thinking, eggs for his family, tasty and fresh. Part 4, and the man climbs higher. Part 5, the mother bird squeals. She ruffles her feathers. She tries to puff herself up to look larger. She presses a little harder on the eggs beneath her. She is fierce. Part 6, what more can the mother bird do? She is smaller and she is but a bird, and her children are vulnerable. Her body shelters them from harm. And the man climbs higher, his hair covered now with dust and twigs. Part 8, he reaches the nest. The mother bird has stopped her call, and the man's and the bird's eyes meet. All is still except for a slight breeze. Part 9, perhaps it is a bat kol. Part 10, and this is Torah, in a tree, one warm sunny morning. The powerless and the powerful meet on a branch, the hand that can take and can make change, and the mother that protects her young. Part 11, the breeze blows. It runs through the hair of the man and the feathers of the bird. Part 12, and the man extends his hand. Part 13, and here is where the story ends, as he and the mother bird meet each other's eyes. Part 14, Torah is about words, but it is more about what we do, how we act, while standing on the branch of a tree one quiet and sunny morning. Part 15, and all the rest is commentary. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Leanne. We always love hearing from you. To me, this was one of the most interesting parts of Makkot because it's not an area of law that we really learn a lot about. And as always, you bring sort of the emotional component to it because in Makkot, at least, it's really just more of a technical. And I don't know, I personally have always been sort of not bothered by that mitzvah, but perplexed by that mitzvah. And especially, I don't know if some of you have seen that there are people who actually purposefully go out of their way to fulfill that mitzvah. Like they do that at one point in their life to say that they actually accomplished it. So thank you very much for that. And that whole notion of sort of, what we think about before we actually take action, which I think is very, very relevant to Makkot. Okay, without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, who is Professor Chaim Saiman. And I'll just give a little bit of an introduction to who he is. So he is Professor Chaim Saiman is a scholar of Jewish law, insurance, and private law, and published the book Halacha, the Rabbinic Ideas of Law, which I highly recommend. I own it. It's a great book. He's also served as the visiting professor of Talmudic law at both Harvard Law School and the University of Pennsylvania Law School, a visiting fellow at Princeton University, and a visiting professor at the University of Toronto, Bar Ilan, Hebrew University, IDC, and Pepperdine University faculties of law. He sits at a rabbinical court with the Beit Din of America and serves as an expert witness in insurance law and Jewish law in federal court. And he is a professor of law at the Charles Whittaker School of Law at Villanova University. So we are really thrilled to have him with us today. And he is going to speak to us a little bit. I'm just going to pin him in a second. Okay. All right. Thank you. Chaim, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Great. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for welcoming me into your chabura. So I thought that we talk a little bit about sort of Makkot, and really Makkot and Sanhedrin, as Anne mentioned, is a unit. And just to the point, Anne, that you made, that though Makkot, in the sense of lashes, does seem to be, a more commonplace or more accessible in the kind of backwards way punishment. The truth is that it's most Rishonim hold that the whole infrastructure of Edim v'Hatra'ah, right, of the witnesses and the warnings, applies equally to Makot as it does to the Mitot Beit Din, as it does to the actual death penalty. In which case, all of the questions that one may have, and that we'll maybe explore a little bit, about the efficacy and purpose of the Mitot Beit Din apply to Makot as well. And I want to frame that because, this is the way, as I spoke with Yardena about, just some issues to kind of think about as we close out, Sanhedrin and Makkot and move on to Shvuot, which is related but a little bit different. FYI, the beginning is very difficult. It's all about Korbanot, but it gets better at the end. To talk about sort of, to me, this is a question, and mentioned, Rome's my book, of it helps to think about what exactly is halacha and what is it doing, and let's frame it this way. As you've learned, from the official Torah perspective, there are basically only two punishments, right? There's either mita or malkut, right? The Torah doesn't know really about jail. The Torah doesn't know about other things. Their stuff accumulates along the way. Makot mardut, right? The rabbinic lashes, various forms of cherem. But at least at that kind of idealized Torah sense, those aren't punishments, right? There's really only mita or makot or bidei shamayim, right? Something that God does, but in terms of humanly instituted punishments. And to the extent that's right, and then to the extent that we apply the entire infrastructure of Edim v'Hatra'ah, right, the witnesses and the warnings that are spelled out mainly in Sanhedrin, to both of these, it doesn't take a criminal law theorist to understand that this isn't really going to deter anybody, and this really isn't going to do anything. And in fact, as you guys learned, the famous Mishnah at the end of the first paragraph of Makkot says this expressly, right? It's a very strange machloket in and of itself, because were there not any executions? And then Rabbi Akiva, who lives after the Sanhedrin kind of would have had power, says, it had I there, I never been. So to me, in the book I wrote, I was very interested in this whole net of questions, which is, what is this stuff, right? We always talk about halacha. We inevitably translate it today as Jewish law. I think that is not a bad translation. I understand that translation, but it's exactly these sugyot that make us say, well, wait a minute. Is it actually doing what we expect law to do, right? At the most foundational level, right? Whatever else you think law is supposed to do, it's supposed to be maintaining social order, right? And then if you say, well, if you have a system with no deterrence, how could it possibly maintain social order? What on earth is the point of this? And in these two Masechtot, we learn that that's not only because, I think there's a facile answer given, which is, well, that was true, meaning, yes, after Galut, and after the Sanhedrin has its power taken away, and after the Churban of Beit HaMikdash, etc., then there's no power behind these. But before that, it's a sort of realized system. And I think as we learn these sugyot here, both Sanhedrin and Makkot, you realize, well, on halacha's own terms, that's probably not right. Because if everybody needs Edim v'Hatra'ah, there might be one exception, maybe we'll talk about that. And then that's basically impossible, unless someone really just wants to be a martyr for their cause, right? You could say, yeah, I would say, basically in order to be executed by the Sanhedrin, right? If someone, I think basically it goes like this: it's Shabbos, right? And I walk under an apple tree, and I'm about to pick an apple, and two kosher witnesses say, hey, Chaim, you know today's Shabbos, and you be chayav skila for picking an apple. And if I count 5 beats, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, say nothing, pick the apple, I'm no tzaddik, but I probably can't get punished by the Sanhedrin. But if I say, I'll not keen on the oseh, like, yes, and that's why I'm doing it, and then pick the apple, probably then. And the same standard applies to Makkot. So what is this? Now, Makkot, a lot of it talks about Edom Zomimim. Another thing that when you kind of went through the requirements, it seems almost impossible to happen. And you know what it doesn't talk about? Much less Edom Achishim, right? The much more normal situation of people disagree. They disagree in part. They disagree in part. They disagree in whole. So in other words, this is another example where it like takes something that you could think would be a major sort of piece of the regulation of the judicial system. It puts it in this very, very particular context. It burrows very deeply into the mechanisms and structures of that, but then kind of leaves vast questions as to what happens outside or beyond that. So this is, and I'm happy to, I tell you what I think, but I just want to like put this on the table that, in other words, I always say that when we translate halakha as Jewish law, we ought to understand that it does both much more and much less than law. And here what I'm seeing is like, here's where it does much less. In other words, capital punishment or like the main punishment, that's like the core, it's not common, but it's sort of the foundation of the deterrent impact of the law. And every legal system has, right, that's basically has some systems of deterrent. And then you see that like halacha sets up this elaborate thing, but when you actually like push through it, it almost is impossible. And then in Sanhedrin and Makkos, we develop what I call second order, I call them sub-halachic modes of enforcement. So in Makkos, the classic example would be Makkos Mardut, right? The rabbinic lashes that are not the Torah lashes, but the standards are lower, right? We have in Sanhedrin, you learn about Makin V'Onshin Shalomi Nadin, right? Various forms of both communal punishments and sort of corporal punishments that don't fit within the formal rubric of the halacha, but were sort of done as backups. Of course, later you have this in Sanhedrin also, but in the medieval ages, we have cherems and nidui, various forms of excommunications, which are ways of enforcing sort of social sanction, not the formalized system. And in fact, there's a great, if we go to Edom, right? In other words, there's this great tshuva of the Rashba, where they have there in Spain, some sort of like halachic enforcement mechanism to make sure everyone is on the straight and narrow there, that they're keeping Shabbos, keeping kosher, etc. Now, who's going to know what goes on in the home, in people's private lives, right? Necessarily people who are krovim, right? People who are related. And as you learned, those people are pasul le'edut. So they say, how could you run a system where basically all evidence you get is by people not qualified to testify? And the Rashba has this great sort of thing. He says, no. All those rules are about the Sanhedrin in the days of yore, when we had the ability to carry everything out the way it was supposed to be. But here, we're in Gullus, we don't have these things, so we kind of make do with what we have. So one of the kind of persistent themes of these two Masechta, which for our purposes we're sort of looking at one, which we look at the sort of administration of the criminal law of halacha, is one, very, very high, almost idealized, unreachable standards for the actual working of the system. Two, a great analytic investment in burrowing into those details, right? And those are many of the Masechtot. So one of my favorite ones is, right, the Sanhedrin never killed anybody, but there's an extended discussion in Sanhedrin as to what happens if a witness who had 2 arms or 2 hands when he witnessed the event, this is Sanhedrin Mem Hey or Mem Dalet, but by the time that the execution comes, he has lost 1 hand, right, due to some accident. How does it work, right? So like that is interesting. There were no witnesses, right? But like all these other questions are just not addressed. And then the kind of third level is that you see a little bit in the Talmud and much more in the Rishonim, a sort of development of what I call a sub-halachic system, a kind of backup system. There's one towards the end of Sanhedrin, if you recall, where they could put someone who was suspected of killing someone in some sort of prison, and maybe they feed him in a way until he dies. So this sort of alternate system that's not the formal system, this sort of subsystem that sort of emerges to play in the gaps of it. And then in the 13th century, the Rashba sort of almost theorized this as, yes, being very clear that there are two systems, one the ideal, that is sort of that which we study, and then one kind of which sort of less regulated by all the things we learn about Sanhedrin Makos, which is what we actually do, whether we call it Makas Martis or Nidoi. They also put people in stocks. They pulled out their eyebrows, all sorts of stuff that happened. There's a great book. Let me see if I have it here. Thought I did. Maybe it's in my other office. A very thick book called, I thought it was right behind me. I'm sorry. Makin Lonchin Shalomi Nadin, which was published about in 2013 in Israel. It's a thick book that basically goes through all the history of kind of alternative halachic punishments, which are not anything we learn about in Sanhedrin and Makos. So the big question is, what is this all about? Right? To take some other examples, from the parsha we just read, or the double parsha, right? We know that the Beit HaMenugeh, the house that has Sarat, the Tosefta says this thing doesn't really exist, doesn't really happen. That same line, the Tosefta, appears about two other topics in Masechet Sanhedrin, the Ir Hanidachat, right? The subverted city, the city that worships Avodah Zarah, and the Ben Sarmor most famously. So, I have my own kind of view. I wrote a little bit of book about it, but maybe I'm happy to kind of like, as you guys have learned this, I don't know, Yardana, if this is within the ambit, to kind of just hear people's thoughts. Have they thought about this? Does this bother them? Is it obvious what the answer is? Am I totally wrong in my question? Kind of what do you think as you've filtered through these various intricate sugyot that are very, very detailed, but then when you step back in a second, and again, the Mishnah and Makos sort of just puts it on a silver platter for you. They're like, what are we actually talking about?
Anybody can feel free to unmute themselves and share a thought.
I have a question about this, and I really appreciate what you're sharing, which is, if it never happened, it astounds me that the rabbis went into so much detail, much of it frankly gory, about the process of killing and punishing in these ways. So I'd love your insights into that.
Okay, but look, one cannot. Here's what one can say. It is hard to find any records in the rabbinic literature of someone getting makos and or getting killed. I'm going to add this provision here, per the requirements set up in those Masechtas. Okay, does anyone remember the one person? This will be a little side note here, but the one character or person or type that does not require hatra'ah, that does not require the elaborate, what as a lawyer I'd call, criminal procedure protections outlined in the halacha. There is one category.
I believe it's the Mesit.
Dana is correct. It's
Right.
the Mesit. The Mesit is the person that convinces people to worship Avodah Zarah. And the Talmud records one Mesit. I don't remember who that is. You've heard of him, trust me. His last name is Christ. Jesus, right? I don't know if you guys, depends which edition of the Gemara you did, whether the excise stories or not. But Jesus, this is to me a whole fascinating side story. I wrote a little article about it. I'll send it around to Yardana and she could share it with you. Short little 3-page article. It's just how Jesus actually in the Talmud's narration is killed by the Sanhedrin because he was a Mesit. There are a few other examples of someone being killed, but all of them are then disputed as to whether they followed the procedures correctly or not. And when it comes to Makkot, I don't think when I looked, I could not find any record of someone getting official formal Makkot, not the Makkot Mardut, but the official formal Makkot. Now, were people killed? Probably. But the question is, once you add all these, so now we also have to say, are we talking, and this I think is also baked into that Mishnah in Makos, are we having a historical conversation as to what actually happened? Or having a kind of halachic conversation on what should happen based on these rules? Or are we having a kind of agadic discussion about sort of what is, right? I think these things are really, really complicated, and they're intertwined with each other in a way that when we think about that word law in a modern legal system, we would very, very much want to disentangle. Because if we're going to pull the full power of the law or the state to harm someone physically, we want to make sure that our standards are super clear and that we've netted out what's history, what's law, normative rules, and what is sort of agadic speculations. And you see here, I think throughout Sanhedrin Makos, these things are entwined with each other.
Okay, anyone have any ideas to this question? Like why would we have this?
Or even how did you think about this as well? Did this come up? Did this sort of did this cross your mind? What did you think? I don't know, answers. I don't have any answers. I have some thoughts.
Fair. I shouldn't say the word answer.
I mean, if someone has an answer, I'd love to hear it.
Okay. Anybody? No one has thought about this? Okay, one person wrote here, well, this was about the lashes. Laura shared that she thought there was something in the Christian Bible about getting lashes. Maybe it was Paul. She texted in second Corinthians 5 times 39 lashes. Okay.
Right. And the question is are those sources, right? Are those sources bound by the Hatra'ah framework, right? The Edom Hatra'ah framework, right? If one thinks historically, one would say, well, that's sort of Chazal's ideas that may not have been in force in previous times. And there's evidence in Chazal, when Chazal do talk about people getting killed, right? They typically kind of, that one time they say it was the Beit Din Shel Tzedukim, right? So which didn't have this apparatus, or they find some other exception, right? So, right, that's what I'm saying. The question is a little bit historically and a little bit sort of halachically, and untangling those is difficult. So, in the Torah, it seems that people do get the death penalty, right? But once we are working with that Edom Atra Toch Kedei Dibur framework, then at the very least, you could say, if that is binding, the person getting the penalty needs to really want to and basically martyr himself or offer himself up as some sort of public object lesson or protest for it, right? But then let's not forget, again, this is why I think the Makkos Mardus is very important, is that it's not that they don't create this kind of like alternate system that has much fewer restrictions, right? You guys remember the Gemara in Sanhedrin about the person who was punished for riding a horse on Shabbos. And the Gemara says, well, wait a minute, how's he punished? That's not a malacha. And say, well, no, that the Beit Din saw that the hour needed, that people were acting inappropriately, and they did that. Right, and the same thing for the couple kind of publicly copulating, right? Which also probably doesn't get you a death penalty or malchus, but they did that then for sort of public morals. So they sort of like the Torah grants a certain power. That power is then radically restricted by Chazal in terms of many of the halachas Sanhedrin, as I forgot who said before. Those are the things that they go on and on and on about, and then they sort of like open up this sort of like other system with like much fewer rules, and then you can sort of, as much as bound. So it's a very interesting, complicated structure. So I don't have an answer, but first thing to me, what this says is that we need to be more deliberate and more thoughtful in how we characterize what this information is. Whether law is the right word. I'm not opposed to it because there's not really a better word, right? Unless we just call it halacha, but that's maybe not helping so much. But to understand that when we call it law, we are inevitably coming with a certain, and I assume there's probably some, but not all lawyers on the, but even if you're just a member of our society, right? When we say the word law, we're coming with a certain basket of assumptions about what that is and what that does. And to see that in some ways that is what this is doing, and in some ways that is not what this is doing. So to at least sort of live with that, as we go forward. And just I'd say, as you go into Shvuot, as I think Anne mentioned, I sit on the Beit Din. We today run a Beit Din system with basically no Shvuot, even though you will learn that and you will see that that is like the sort of engine of the civil justice system. We really don't do Shvuot anymore. We also don't very rarely have formal Eidut, right? And all the cases I've never had two kosher witnesses come and say, and again, these are civil cases, but two kosher witnesses come and say, okay, yes, we witnessed this transaction and this occasionally happens. But then the arguments of whether they paid back or not, or this, or how it worked, or whether the goods supplied were the right ones, all that is not coming through Eidut, right? It's coming through party testimony, through emails, through receipts, through all sorts of stuff. So again, I'm picking Sanhedrin Makkot because we're doing that, but really as you go forward into Shavuot, I think the same sort of questions emerge to one degree or another. So as I said, to me, the first thing is, let's use the word law, but let's understand the ways in which halakha is working as law and the way the halakha is not working as law. I think just an awareness. Another thing that a bunch of scholars, and here I, certainly not the originator of this, both in America and in Israel, have thought is like, well, maybe we ought to read this a little bit differently. In other words, and I think this is true of many areas, it's just here it's almost glaring you in the face, that these are frameworks for thinking through ideas of, let's say, crime and punishment and culpability and things like that, that are somewhat separate from whether the system actually operates as described. And I thought maybe I'd give you an example, admittedly it's an example from Sanhedrin, but it's very much connected to an example or to the types of things that come up in Makkot as well. So if you recall, there is a Mishnah in the 6th parak of Sanhedrin that talks about what if someone is taken out to be killed, through skila, right? Stoning, which isn't exactly stoning, right? The sort of pushing off the cliff or the structure. So the Mishnah says as follows: when they approach the Beit HaSkila, right, the place where this would happen, so if he were a man, they would undress the man except for like a little bit. And the Rabbi Yehuda's view is both men and women would be basically undressed. The man would be covered what they call one place in front, and the woman would be covered two places in front and in back. That's Rabbi Yehuda. And the Chachamim say that no, the woman is not undressed, she is stoned clothed. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Now again, when you just look at this from the perspective we've been thinking about, you're going to ask all these questions, like, why do you need a Mishnah to tell us about how men, if no one's being stoned anyway, what is this about? Now, one of the examples I point out in my book kind of comes from this, because the Gemara tries different frameworks as to kind of what this debate is, between why a man is, this debate between Chacham and Rabbi Yehuda about, everybody agrees that a man is stoned naked, but not a woman. And eventually the Gemara comes to the following. It says, here's what we think is going on, is that this is a tension between what they call bizayon and what they call tsar, right? Or nicha de gufe, which is sort of comfort or pain. So the Gemara's assumption, and I think we just have to take this assumption, is that the clothing is somewhat protective, and therefore the execution process will take longer, okay, and therefore be more painful because it's dragged out. Whereas if this were to happen naked or less clothed, right, this would be a shorter, less painful process. And where it says, well, maybe here's the issue, is sort of like, if we have to balance pain, physical pain, versus sort of shame, which one is more important, right? And that's how they structure the debate between Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. So in other words, the Chachamim who say that the woman should remain clothed, say, as between shame and pain, we think shame is a more important factor, and therefore we'll sort of add a little pain in order to save some shame. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says, no, no, no. People would much rather be shamed than prolong their pain. All right, so A, let's just note that's already a slightly different framework. And then this is the point that both in the Gemara and later in Rishonim, this framework travels. Because there's a bunch of places where the shame, pain trade-off can show up. So for example, elsewhere the Gemara discusses, what do you do if someone comes in need of tzedakah for food versus someone comes for need of tzedakah for clothing? Who is preferred? And they, of course, reference back this discussion because the idea of no clothing is shame, and the idea of no food is pain or sort of bodily affliction. And how do we balance it? And are they balanced the same for men or for women or not? If we go to more modern things, right, when we talk about battlefield ethics and sort of triage situations, right? So also there you can get into shame versus pain discussions. And the truth is, if one looks both in the Gemara and even more later on, this sort of framework is returned to in a variety of situations that have nothing to do with this Amud Haskila, right? With this idea of someone being killed, but it becomes a way in which halacha talks about the type of trade-off will show up in a variety of areas of life. I mean, hopefully never, right? But these things do happen, and this is the way it's discussed. So if we use this again, I don't have big answers, but at least let's focus like on one little thing here. That maybe the way to think about these things is less in terms of like how did it work or when did it happen, but what are the kind of different ideas being conveyed through the discussions, right? What are the trade-offs, right, that are all over Sanhedrin and Makkos about these sorts of questions? And then this is the way, I think this to me is, this is the way we talk about these things, right? You're not going to find an essay in classical Jewish sources about, pain versus shame. It's not the way they talk, right? What you are going to find is a kind of halachic discussion, seems very technical, and then a little debate, and then you could start seeing that in the Gemara, and later on it gets kind of slightly more robust as the sort of balancing between these two conflicting criteria come in. And I think you could see this both in Masechet Sanhedrin in many places, and I think you see this all over the place. Now, does this explain
Can I interrupt
everything?
with the question?
Let me just finish the thing. So does this
Sure.
explain everything? Absolutely not. But I think to me, it's a framework through which to try to think about this material that we've been learning. At least some of it may carry this weight. And it's not really exactly how that thing that is being talked about there exactly worked. But Chazal always like to plant their ideas within specific halachic context and sort of grow out from there. Okay, Anne, go ahead.
So my question is, and I realize it's speculative, I don't think that there's any way to define this kind of answer, but what do you think Chazal thought they were doing? That they were talking about philosophical issues that are innate in the halacha or whatever, however we would characterize a pain versus shame kind of discussion? Or were they just talking about the halacha as if it's in practice, even though it technically actually wasn't?
Okay, so let's start with, I'm going to agree with the first thing. We would have to speculate. So I do think the following, that they clearly were much more comfortable, or let's put it this way, they were very uncomfortable talking of philosophy the way the Greeks would, right? Put up an idea, what is it, right? That we know. They almost never do that. What they are much more comfortable doing is talking in halachic terms, and then spinning out from them things that sort of begin to approach that. I think that is clear. So, Chazal will never talk about, is truth an absolute value or a relative value, right? But they will talk about, famous song, Ketzad Baraktim Bifnei Hakala, right? How do you, so is it better to tell the truth, Kala Kmochehi, or is it better to say Kala Nava Chasuda, right? Or, Mutar L'Shanot Bifnei Shalom, right? Or stories like that, right? They will never talk about the work-life balance right? But they will talk about, well, Kriyat Shema you can say in the tree while you're working, but Shemona Esrei you got to say, you got to break, right? So I think it's very clear that they are not comfortable, and maybe even affirmatively rejecting. That's a little harder, but I think you can sustain it. This sort of Greek way of talking about, but they're very well aware that these are issues that bracket. These are issues that every society will talk about one way or another, and for Chazal, halacha becomes that medium. Whether it's because halacha is the most important thing, and therefore everything gets filtered through there, or everything gets filtered through there, therefore halacha becomes the most important thing, or probably some combination of those two. But I think that's, to me, clear that they are very, very comfortable backing out of something very narrow into something very broad, and very, very uncomfortable putting a very broad claim on the board and then trying to prove it. And I think you can see this in many, many sugyot. Why it's a historical way or what is conscious and what is not, I think is very, very hard to know. I think there we'd have to guess. But I would say at the end of the day, right, our society a certain way, right? I always say we use science fiction to talk about a lot of stuff like this, right? If you're into, I mean, every culture has its ways of dealing with these kinds of questions, right? And again, I think sci-fi is a great way. You can imagine this other world, and then you could what happens if we maximize this? What happens if we maximize this? What happens if this goes away, right? That's the way kind of we use that. We had a poetic reading earlier that's also sort of imagining some space. So I think that I do believe that Chazal use halachic discussions to do some of that. That's not the only thing going on in those discussions, but that is certainly at least one of the things going on in this discussion. I just say it's also not clear how much dividing them the way we are talking, are these our categories or their categories? In other words, one feels that yes, they would say, yes, that's what halacha is. It's all of these things. It a little bit drives us crazy because we want to divide art and literature and poetry and law and philosophy and theology into separate boxes, right? One way to think about it is yeah, that's the way we think about the world. That's not the way they think about the world.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions, comments before we wrap up Makkot?
I'll just add there's a great there's a telling story. This is an American law agada, but it's still a good one. So the late Justice Antonin Scalia, who maybe you've heard of, probably known kind of a formalist conservative on the court, and culturally too. He was once on a panel, but a lover of opera, and he was once on the panel with the Juilliard School with Stephen Sondheim and a whole bunch of very well-known people in the arts, of which he is politically and culturally vastly different world, and that's kind of why the thing was funny. And what he said was as follows in his little study. He says, "Look, you meaning the audience of assembled artistic types, your job is to use language for irony, for complexity, right? For humor, right? For all the things that good art and literature does, that's how you use language." And he says, "I'm a judge and I'm a lawyer, and my job is to keep I'm paraphrasing here, but that the law should be as flat and as boring as possible and subject to only one meaning. Because if we're going to impose the power on the state on someone, we want that to be unequivocal." Okay, that's Scalia's view. Now, whether he's right about American law, we could debate. But to me, it's very telling that that's exactly what halacha isn't, right? It's exactly what halacha isn't. It's a mix of these things. And one of the, to me, most interesting features is it's trying to do both those things that Scalia thinks are opposite of each other, right? The sort of humanist literary part, or the artistic part, and the regulatory part. So for Scalia, in the modern sense, those must be separate because collapsing them will lead to very bad results because you never know exactly what the rules are. And I think certainly the Gemara, right, talk about later periods, but the Gemara clearly rejects that binary. I think that I can say with very clearness that no, the regulatory work can be done in agadic language, agadic work can be done in regulatory language. These things can swim together, and that at least for the Talmud, separating them and putting them in exactly the right place is not the operating question, is not the animating question. Later, that becomes a much more important question. Maybe that we could save for another time.
Thank you so much. This was great. And I think you really put into perspective a lot of what we learned in Sanhedrin. Oh, somebody wrote here, one could claim that Chazal invented intersectionality.
There's an article waiting to be written.
Okay, I think that's a fair comment. But I think you really helped us put into perspective that I think a lot of what we had been learning, we knew it didn't actually happen. And I think that's one thing that Ann and I talk a lot about on the podcast. You know, when we talk about a certain halacha, does Chazal give us an example or do they not give us an example? And we were very struck by in Sanhedrin and Makkot, there are basically no real life examples, as opposed to the Babas, which had a lot of examples.
That's 100% correct. 100% correct. And you know, as you move towards Avodah Zarah, you'll see real life. I think Avodah Zarah is almost the opposite. You'll see real life there all the time.
Great. Thank you so much. We hope you'll join us another time.
Okay,
Seriously.
Leitroth, enjoy.
Thank you so much. We're gonna do our official siyum, even though we've already moved into Shavuot because that's how it works, right? So I'm just gonna read the very end of Masechet Makkot. Yardena will take the Hadran, and then we'll see you at the end of June. Okay, we have an incident, right? Shuv pam achat hayu olin achat hayu olin li Yerushalayim. The sages went up to Jerusalem. Kevan shigu lahar tzofim. They got to Mount Scopus. Karu bigdehem. They tore their garments. Kevan shigu lahar habayit. When they got to the Temple Mount, ra'u shu'al shiyatzami beit kodesh kodeshim. They saw a fox that came out from the area that was the Holy of Holies. Itzchilu hin bochin. They started to cry, to weep. Rabbi Kiva mitzachik, and Rabbi Kiva laughed. Amrulo mipnei mata mitzachik, and they asked him, "Why are you laughing?" Amar lahem mipnei matem bochim. Why are you crying? Amrulo mekom shekatuv bo v'hazdar hakarev yumat, the place about which it was written that the stranger who comes here would die. V'achshav shualim halchubo, and not only is that not happening, but foxes are running here, meaning it's a pure sign of desolation. Shouldn't we weep? Meaning, doesn't that make the most sense? This is a terrible, horrible thing. Amar lahen lakachani b'tzachik, and that's exactly why I'm laughing. Dichtiv va'ida lo edim namanim et Uriah Kohen ve'et Zechariah ben Yevarchayu. He says we have testimony from the prophets, from both Uriah HaKohen and Zechariah ben Yevarchayu. These are the prophets who have we have their books of prophecy or their statements of prophecy. Inyan Uriah Etzel Zechariah. What does one have to do with the other? Because we know that Uriah lived much earlier than Zechariah. Uriah b'mikdash Rishon, he lived in the time of the temple, the first temple. Zechariah b'mikdash Sheni, and Zechariah prophesied about the second temple. Ela tzalak katuv nevuato shel Zechariah b'nevuato shel Uriah. The verses, the Torah, or I guess the Bible really, subordinates Zechariah's prophecy to Uriah's prophecy, namely, about Uriah, or from Uriah, it's written, for your sake, Zion will be plowed like a field, meaning desolate. And Zechariah said that it will yet come to pass that the elderly men and women will sit in the streets of Jerusalem. Until the prophecy of Uriah came to pass, before, in this time period, before Uriah's prophecy came to pass, I might have feared that Zechariah's prophecy would not come to pass. Now that we've seen before our eyes this prophecy of Uriah, I know, meaning he has confidence that Zechariah's prophecy will yet come to pass. And we've talked about how we see it in our own day. And then they said to him, Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us in that the desolation that they saw before their eyes was not going to be eternal, that they had the prophecy to attest to that.
Okay, let's go to the Hadran. Hadran alach Masechet Makkot v'Hadran alam. Datan alach Masechet Makkot v'Datan alach. Lo nishjasei minech Masechet Makkot v'lo nitneshei minan lo ba'alma hadim v'lo ba'alma da'ata. Yirato b'nacha Adonai Eloheinu v'le'avotenu שתהא תורתך אמונתנו בעולם הזה, ותהא עמנו לעולם הבא. חניני בר פפא, רמי בר פפא, נחמן בר פפא, אחי בר פפא, אבא מרי בר פפא, רפרם בר פפא, רחיש בר פפא, סורחה בר פפא, עדה בר פפא, דרה בר פפא. ערב נא אדוני אלוהינו את דברי תורתנו בפינו ובפיית עמך בישראל, ונענה כולנו אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בישראל, כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך, והווי תחנכני מצוותך כי לעולם היא לי בי תמיד בכל ככה למען לא אבוש, לעולם לא אשכח פקודך כי בם חיתני, ברוך אתה אדוני למדנו כל ככה, אמן 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 סלע ועד. מודים אנחנו לפניך אדוני אלוהינו ולאהבתנו, ששמת חלקנו מיושבי בית המדרש ולא שמת חלקנו מיושבי קרנות, שאנו משכימים והם משכימים, אנו משכימים לדברי תורה והם משכימים לדברי בטלים, אנו עמלים והם עמלים, אנו עמלים מקבלים שכר והם עמלים ואינם מקבלים שכר, אנו רצים והם רצים, אנו רצים לחיי עולם הבא והם רצים לבאר שחת, שנאמר ואתה אלוהי תורדים לבאר שחת, אנשי דמים ומרמה לא יחצו ימיהם ואנחנו נבטח בך. יהי רצון לפניך אדוני אלוהי כשם שעזרתנו לסיים מסכת מכות, כן תעזרנו להתחיל מסכתות וספרים אחרים לסיים, ללמוד וללמד, לשמור ולעשות ולקיים את כל דברי תלמוד תורתך באהבה, וזכות כל התנאים והמורים ותלמידי חכמים, יעמוד לנו ולזרענו שלא תמוש התורה מפינו ומפי זרענו עד עולם. ויתקמם בנו, בהתהלכך תנחה אותך, בשפעך תשמור עליך, והקיצותה היא תשיחך. כי וירבו ימיך ויוסיפו לך שנות החיים, אורך ימים בימינה ובשמאל יאושר וכבוד. אדוני עוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. About 6 weeks, I think.
Thank you all.